What was your relationship like with Steve Jobs?
Back in the early 1980s, Steve Jobs and I spent 5 months getting to know each other before I ended up joining Apple. I was not the first choice to become CEO of Apple. Steve wanted to be CEO himself, though I didn't know it at the time. But they went through something like 20 different candidates. And while the board wouldn't choose Steve as the largest shareholder, chairman of the board, and co-founder of Apple to be CEO back when he was 26 years old, what they did say was, Steve, you get veto rights on who we choose. And he turned down everybody that was brought from the high-tech industry as a candidate. So then David Rockefeller, one of the early investors through Venrock, said, well, why don't we look at another industry in another part of the country? And that's how I surfaced. The result was that when I came to Apple, I was brought in for two very clear reasons. First was that the entire cash flow of Apple came from one product, the Apple II. The Apple III had already failed. Lisa was in the process of failing. And the Macintosh was a year away from being introduced, and it was not expected to have any positive cash flow for at least 3 years. So the first job I had required no knowledge of computers at all. It required marketing. The other reason I was brought was to be Steve's partner, and Steve was creating the Macintosh. I had nothing to do with creating the Macintosh. I didn't know how to create a personal computer back in the early 1980s. So my job there was to help with the marketing launch of the Macintosh. And we launched it with a commercial that became famous called 1984 at the 1984 Super Bowl. So Steve and I got along just great for both of those roles that I had. Where things fell apart, because we were not just business colleagues, we were really good friends. And Steve didn't have a lot of friends. He was totally focused on changing the world and building Apple, and he didn't have time for friendships. And so he and I would spend every day together. We would be often walking the campus at Stanford or the campus at Apple or up in the hills above Silicon Valley together on the weekends. So we had much more than just a business relationship. And the thing which broke down between us was that in 1985, a year after the Macintosh was introduced, Steve introduced the Macintosh Office, which was the first time that a laser printer was connected with a Macintosh to create what we later learned to call desktop publishing. And it didn't work very well. Steve went into an incredible depression over this. And he turned on me. And he said, it's your fault because you made me price the Macintosh $500 too high. I want to drop the price of the Mac by $500. And I want you to shift the advertising away from the Apple II over to the Mac. And I said, Steve, if we do that, we're going to drive Apple into a loss, and we're a public company. We've got to go to the board of directors. And so we did go to the board. The board listened to both of us. They asked the vice chairman of Apple, who was also the third co-founder, Mike Markkula, to study it, talk to Apple executives and engineers, and he came back about a week later to the board, not to me, not to Steve, and said, I agree with John, I don't agree with Steve. This has nothing to do with anything Apple can do anything about. It's not about prices, it's not about market spend, it's that we're just too early with this type of functionality. And after, Steve was never fired, as you would know if you anyone had read the book Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. But here he was, this visionary founder, tremendously demoralized because the board asked him to step down running the Macintosh division. He went on sabbatical. He later resigned from the company. But the real message there to me was that here was this genius who at that point was not the savvy business executive. He went on to start Next, and that was not particularly successful. But he was always the person who saw where the world was going.